is dedicated to the launch of a new Forum Asia report titled Defending in Numbers, Rising Together Against All Odds. And we will also talk more about the situation of human rights defenders in the region. This is the 5th edition of Defending in Numbers, a biennial publication which is released by Forum Asia to highlight the key trends of violations against human rights defenders in the region. Before introducing the speakers, I would like to share a bit more about the two organizations who are co-organizing this event, Forum Asia and LST, or Law Society Trust. Forum Asia, or the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, is a regional human rights organization that was established in 1991 in Bangkok, where the secretariat is, and then also we have regional offices in Kathmandu, Geneva, and Jakarta. We are a membership-based organization, and we work closely with our 85 member organizations across 23 Asian countries. As a regional human rights organization, Forum Asia strives to the promotion and advancement of human rights and sustainable development through a series of activities, including advocacy, capacity and coalition building, documentation and research, and networking. And LST, or Law Society Trust, is a leading Sri Lankan human rights organization established in 1982, working in the country to promote human rights through activities such as legal training and legal documentation, research, capacity building, solidarity in the country and beyond. LST is a member of Forum Asia and also a key partner for the implementation of Forum Asia's activities in Sri Lanka. And LST is also hosting today's event, so big thanks to LST for this. And before introducing the panelists, I would like to invite the executive directors of LST and Forum Asia to deliver an opening remark. So first of all, I would like to ask Sakuntala Kadir Gamar to join us for an opening remark, and this will be followed by a video message from Mary Eileen Diaz-Bacalso, who is the executive director of Forum Asia. So Sakuntala, over to you.
Report on the works of the threats and challenges faced by human rights defenders in Asia. Law and Society Trust, as you've heard, is a partner, a long-standing partner of Forum Asia, and we have benefited from being a part of this amazing network, enjoying solidarity and support, and also providing it to other members of the network. We are stronger through our unity and our shared commitments to defending and realizing human rights. Defending in Numbers, Rising Together Against All Odds is a remarkable report. It is concise, yet comprehensive. While it is depressing, it is also readable. And it's a perfect reference tool to be used when calling on violators to account, be they governments or corporates or non-state actors. It tells them, we have our eyes on you and your actions are recorded. They are not forgotten. The report provides a snapshot of the region, encompassing specific references to violations and attacks on human rights defenders in Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Timor-Leste, amongst others. It tabulates the most common violations against human rights defenders: judicial and administrative harassment, physical violence, intimidation and threats, and psychological violence. It highlights the human rights defenders most at risk: pro-democracy defenders, women human rights defenders, minority rights defenders, and land and indigenous rights defenders, and environmental activists. They're all high on the risk, and they're high on the list of any risk assessment. Women and men defending the rights of people of different sexual orientations, they are particularly at risk. And youth and student defenders are subjected to harassment. Their right to political activism is either ridiculed or undermined and attacked. NGOs are always in the sights of governments, as are their staff and even their families. partners and associates of human rights defenders, the net is very wide. It is not only protesters, mobilizers, lawyers, and journalists who are targeted, but artists and poets and online activists as well are threatened. To us in Sri Lanka, this report is particularly well timed. In the post-Aragalaya time, it is surreal that the government formed as a result of the struggle and the president situated in an executive office as a result of the struggle should be the strongest in attacking pro-democracy activists. But that is the situation that we find ourselves in. Anti-terror laws have been used, very loosely defined, against student activists and anyone else who's politically active. Even more draconian anti-terrorist laws are considered that loosely define who is a terrorist and what actions are considered to be acts of terror. Laws to control broadcasting and social media, the lifeblood of the right to information and the freedom of expression, are also in the pipeline. Suppression of trade unions and environmental activists are also considered. In the context of the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is in, the painful structural readjustments of policies that will impact the poor are considered, and those who feel the impact of these policies have no voice or platform to be heard. Defending one's rights to livelihoods is also threatening these days. Learning of the commitment of human rights defenders across the region to intervene against such actions, against government actions and corporations that trample on the rights of people is inspiring. Knowing that there is solidarity and their struggles and violence against them will not go unnoticed and that there will be challenges against impunity is heartening. I hope that this report will create greater solidarity amongst human rights defenders in the region, and that this report and other reports will be considered in international forums requiring accountability. And most of all, I hope that our governments in the region will address their need to comply with the international human rights standards that they have signed on to. Thank you, and I look forward to a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Sakuntala, for this inspiring opening remark, which also echoes quite much the key findings from the report. And now I'd like to ask, if possible, to display the video message from Mary Eileen Diaz-Bacalso, Executive Director of Forum Asia.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, or Forum Asia, which is a membership organization focusing on the issue of civic space, fundamental freedoms, and the protection of human rights defenders. Forum Asia has consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council and with the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. On behalf of Forum Asia, I would like to thank everyone present here today to witness with us the launch of this relevant report entitled Defending in Numbers, Rising Together Against All Odds. Also, I likewise thank our partner in Sri Lanka, Law and Trust Society, for accompanying us in making this relevant report see the light of day. The launch of this report gives us mixed feelings. While we have a sense of accomplishment that we were able to chronicle the various forms of human rights violations of human rights defenders across Asia, we lament that 25 years after the adoption of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, adopted by consensus at the UN General Assembly in 1998, violations of human rights defenders' rights, especially of those in difficult situations, continue to increase with its passing day. As we launch this report, it is very ironic that the United Nations will be commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the 10th of December this year, but violations of human rights of defenders continue unabated. In 2021 and 2022, the promotion and advancement of human rights and democracy in Asia encountered various obstacles. As we emerge from the pandemic, the challenges brought by the COVID-19 pandemic were gradually being overcome. However, new issues arose from drastic political changes and crises in the region. In the context of authoritarian regimes, shrinking civic space, and the consequent violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights, human rights defenders courageously fight for the promotion and protection of human rights in their respective countries. In the course of their human rights advocacy, they have learned to adapt to unprecedented contexts and have persisted in defending human rights under precarious circumstances. In so doing, they were consequently exposed to and continue to suffer from multiple forms of persecution. Forum Asia's publication, Defending in Numbers, Rising Together Against All Odds, illustrates the status of Asian defenders in 2021 and 2022, and identifies the main patterns of violations that they endured as a result of their work. This fifth edition of Defending in Numbers chronicles cases of violations of human rights defenders categorized according to pro-democracy defenders, women human rights defenders, and SOGI rights defenders, land, indigenous, environmental, and community-based defenders, and other groups of defenders. Highlighted in this report is the arbitrary detention of Mr. Khurram Parvez, a leading human rights defender from Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir and chairperson of the Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, or AFAD. He is currently arbitrarily detained for more than 500 days due to his peaceful work. Despite being criminalized, his human rights work is getting international recognition, as he was recently listed among the 100 most influential persons of the year 1922 by Time magazine, and Khurram is being held in pre-trial detention since November 2021, and in early 2023, he became Martin Ennals Award laureate. Defending in Numbers emphasizes that the challenges faced by human rights defenders in the regional level were exacerbated by some crises at the national level, primarily in Myanmar and Afghanistan. Other countries such as Sri Lanka and Kazakhstan experienced nationwide events that had great impact on the human rights community at large, and likewise on defenders. The years 2021 and 2022 saw an increasing participation of civil society in the human rights movement. Teachers and youth joined the civil disobedience movement to counter the attempted coup in Myanmar. Women and girls led protests against severe restrictions imposed by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Students and monks took part in mass demonstrations in Sri Lanka.
for the period of 2 years. We have documented a total of 1,636 cases of violations that have affected 4,450 human rights defenders during this time, including family members, organizations, and communities. During the 2-year period, we have documented cases from 22 countries in Asia, including in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, Central Asia, and Northeast Asia. Moving on to the methodology of how this report was drafted, all of the cases that we have documented and analyzed are from our Asian Human Rights HRD's portal. You can see the landing page here, or you can also access it through the QR code on the right side there. Here you can search different cases according to different categories, countries, and time frames. In recording these cases, we ensure that the following 4 criteria are met: that the source is credible, that the human rights defender or group is named and the type of violation is specified, that to the extent possible, we include information on their status as human rights defenders, and that their identity, such as gender, ethnicity, or whether they're from indigenous group, is included. Finally, we ensure that there is a clear, proximate, and documented connection between the human rights defender's work and the violation that has occurred. So I will start with the most common types of violations that have been committed against the defenders in 2021 and 2022. First was judicial harassment with 1,033 cases out of 1,636 cases that involved judicial harassment of some form. And the common forms of judicial harassment included arrest and detention, including arbitrary arrest and detention, enactment of repressive legislation and policies, and denial of fair trial. The defenders who were most affected by judicial harassment were pro-democracy defenders, women human rights defenders, and media workers. And we have recorded that at least 1/3 of all cases of judicial harassment were perpetrated because of the defenders' participation in or organization of protests and demonstrations, thus severely affecting their freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and their right to protest. Second, we recorded 516 cases of physical violence against the defenders. Alarmingly, the number of cases of physical violence that we recorded have increased drastically in the past years, having placed this category of violation as the second most common type of violation against the defenders. We have recorded that state actors, including the police and the military, were the main perpetrators of physical violence. And we have also noted that 104 out of 516 cases of physical violence, so almost 1/5 of the cases, have resulted in the death of defenders and their family members, with at least 188 individuals who have died as a result. Intimidation and threats included death threats, as well as vilification, online attacks, and harassment. And they were directed at both the human rights defenders and their family members. And they have posed serious threats to the well-being of the defenders and the work that they carry out. I would like to highlight a few case studies that we have included in the publication. The first case study that I want to highlight is the case of Fatia Molidianti and Haris Azhar in Indonesia, who are facing judicial charges for a YouTube video in which they discuss the connection between the militarization and mining operation in Papua and involvement of a public official in it. Their case is currently ongoing, and it is an emblematic case of judicial harassment, specifically defamation, in the form of defamation charges against the defenders. The second case is of Farazan Safi and other Afghan women human rights defenders, whose names are not revealed. They were found dead with evidence of shooting on their bodies after the Taliban takeover. And Farazan was last reportedly have been looking ways to move out of the country because of her work as a human rights defender and the consequences that has on her security. With that, I would like to move on to the next chapter, scanning the perpetrators. Majority of the cases were perpetrated by state actors, with 1,354 out of 1,636 cases that involved state actors. And they were, the biggest perpetrator were judiciary, showing the military's complete control over the legal and justice system, and its Article 505 on fake news and incitement charges. In Afghanistan, we have noted that since the Taliban takeover on 15 August 2021, all violations against human rights defenders where the perpetrator was known were committed by the Taliban. The violations included physical violence, including killings of the defenders, arrests and detention, and house raids with no punishment or responsibility of the perpetrators. Both the situations in Myanmar and Afghanistan highlight how the perpetrators are operating in this culture of impunity in a legal vacuum where they are unpunishable and also often unidentifiable. Now moving on to the final chapter highlighting the human rights defenders who are at highest risk. The top 3 defenders at risk in 2021 and 2022 were pro-democracy defenders, women human rights defenders, and sexual orientation and gender identity rights defenders, and land, indigenous, environmental, and community-based defenders. You can see that 450 cases involved pro-democracy defenders, closely followed by 443 cases involving women human rights defenders, and 333 cases involved land, indigenous, environmental, and community-based defenders. Wayan Phyomo is a Myanmar pro-democracy defender and a student leader who was arrested in March 2021 due to his participation in anti-coup demonstration. He has been in detention since then on incitement charges. In detention, it was reported that he was also brutally beaten by the prison guards for staging a silent strike against the military junta. Following is the case of Pakistani women human rights defenders Nahid Bibi, Irshad Bibi, Ayesha Bibi, and Javeria Bibi, who were killed by a shooting while in transportation. They worked for an NGO named Sapawan, working on vocational training for local women and on empowerment of women and gender rights. I would like to end this presentation with a set of recommendations. 1, for states to uphold and implement international obligations. 2, for states to ensure timely investigations into violations against human rights defenders. 3, for all entities, including states and civil society, to implement strong and effective protection mechanism of human rights defenders. 4, for international community, regional community, and local community to consistently and effectively address the situation of Asian human rights defenders and take proactive measures. And finally, to stop all harassment, for all harassment against human rights defenders to be stopped immediately and entirely. Well, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm excited to hear questions and to have further discussions. And you can access the report online with the QR code on the screen here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Hadrian, for this very comprehensive overview. Okay, round of applause. Thank you. And so as Hadrian mentioned, like the report is now online. You can find it for Forum Asia website. And for those who are attending in person, we also brought a number of printed copies. So make sure you get one if you're interested in it. I think they're at the reception desk. So now, after hearing about regional trends, we can move to the second panelist, Diane. Diane serves as protection coordinator for South Asia and Mongolia with Frontline Defenders. And Diane will tell us a bit more about the key patterns of violations against defenders in South Asia. So we move from a regional framework to a more specific South Asian overview. So Diane, over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I hope you can hear me. So 2021 and 22 were exceptionally difficult. I feel like we say this when we review every year. Like we start with this. It was a particularly difficult year for human rights defenders in Asia or South Asia, but it really was. It was unprecedented. We had never dealt with the kind of global health crisis that we experienced through 21-22. We then dealt with the fallout of that crisis, which was the restrictions that states imposed using the crisis. But also defenders had to grapple with the economic crisis that hit South Asia particularly badly. All the defenders we spoke to, none of them were working from great income levels anyway. So while struggling to survive themselves, they were then supposed to respond to the crisis that was affecting their communities. They seemed to impact women more than men, and not to generalize, but they seemed to take on more of a burden of having to respond. It also impacted LGBTIQ defenders in so many countries where they felt that the community needed them. Sex worker rights defenders, there was a report that we published which reflected this, that they felt that they were on the front line of having to support, and then they were also facing attacks from the state. They were being told that if they did not provide this kind of hardware support, we saw this in Sri Lanka, but we've also seen this in other countries, they couldn't continue to work. But in the case of Kashmiri defenders, we have examples where they kept getting stopped at these checkpoints while trying to deliver support to communities that had been worst affected, because in all these contexts where defenders work, the state has systematically destroyed systems of support, of survival. And this is why reports like this are important. The work of Forum Asia and the portal is important to highlight the difficulties, the challenges, but it's also an opportunity to talk beyond the challenges. Defenders are more than the risks they face. We are what drives us, what motivates us, why the communities we represent. Behind each of us, when they attack us or they attack defenders, they attack you because you're speaking truth to power and you're representing a community that they would like to stay silent. Khurram was discussed today. Khurram and Irfan are in jail. So many in Kashmir of our friends are silenced today because the work they were doing was deeply uncomfortable, documenting the violations, the killings, the torture, the systematic deprivation, the grabbing of land, the utilization of state resources, not just the taglines that we in the international community or in capitals absorb. They were actually talking about what happens on the ground, and that makes them dangerous. Similarly for defenders in Sri Lanka, there's nothing more dangerous than survivor-defender communities. There's nothing more dangerous than youth taking to the streets who actually know what they're talking about. Because, they're not taking some details from somebody and writing a report and coming and presenting it. They're speaking their truth. And then the pushback and the vulnerability is so much harder. 22 was hard also because we watched 21, 22. We watched the international community and the global community sit back in silence while defenders felt more and more isolated and felt very alone. And it didn't matter what your profile was. If your profile was good enough, you might actually get, the PTA or the UAPA in India, But if you were an unknown defender sitting in Madhya Pradesh in India or in Chhattisgarh, or in Afghanistan, it's not about the anti-terror law. So I think this is really important to acknowledge the sense of isolation and the cost to defenders to speak out in these incredible times. Just in terms of patterns of violations, to touch back, legal persecution, the misuse, selective application, and abuse of law has been a recurrent theme in the targeting of defenders in our communities.
The most highlighted cases that I mentioned are those of prominent defenders held under the anti-terror law. We all know the cases from Sri Lanka. We all know their names. We know the cases from India. We know the cases of Professor Ismail from Pakistan. We know that Idris Katak was tried under the Official Secrets Act. He himself is a victim of enforced disappearance. He's languishing in jail. But what we don't know and we don't understand is, why are these laws important? Why is the ICCPR important when we have the penal code? Why is the PTA important, or the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act in India, important when you have the penal code? Because it allows for pre-trial detention, prolonged detention, and it allows that, and it effectively ties the hands of the judiciary. It also allows states to go before anyone, any type of scrutiny, and say, don't interfere, this is sovereignty. We do not engage with the judiciary. This is independence of our judiciary. This is not independence. From the moment you decide to target someone online, from the moment you decide to launch an inquiry, call somebody for interrogation, this is not the judiciary. This is the executive. This is the police. This is the national investigative agencies. This is the Criminal Investigation Department, depending on the country. But they are interchangeable. Similar to these laws, equally useful to the ICCPR Act is a pattern in India where you file, and I can see this in Sri Lanka also, you file multiple cases. So you have 50 cases, 30 cases. In fact, you're getting bail today under the penal code, and you know by evening, here comes the UAPA charge. And it's a gift that keeps on giving, because it's the one particular police complaint in the citizens, but is commonly known as the CAA cases, where large numbers of defenders who campaigned peacefully against the Citizenship Amendment Act in India were jailed. But there was this one case filed by an anonymous complaint, and that is the case that would keep recurring. We see this pattern in South Asia. All states are drinking from the same jug of water. Recurrent cases are as good at keeping defenders in jail as UAPA and PTA and the anti-terror laws and the national security laws. And then, as I said, far more as disturbing are the large numbers of arrests we see, especially with movements. We saw that with Aragalaya. We see it in indigenous and Dalit movements for land and forest rights. And we see it with the PTM, with the crackdown in Pakistan on PTM activists, not to be confused with PTI activists. PTM is a human rights movement, where the sheer scale of arrest is meant to silence, diminish, and ask you to shut up and sit down, otherwise it's your turn. And nobody can quite comprehend how to respond to the scale of arrest. So we don't. We don't know all their names. We don't know where they are. We don't know who their lawyers are. And this is a fait accompli. And in reflecting on these trends, I'm also reflecting on how we can do better. Because the work that defenders are doing in documenting, knowing those names, knowing the families, is what then gets them arrested. Case in point, Bhima Koregaon case in India. These are defenders who defended others, and that's why they're in jail. I've often joked with some of the lawyers here that sometimes, the next is them. It's almost like saying, I want my lawyer, and the lawyer says, I'm here. I'm right here. So this cost is very high. And many of these arrests happen hidden from view. I just want to touch on a few more trends. One is disinformation. We see this again in the recent past in Sri Lanka very successfully. We've seen this in all the countries. This is a pattern across countries. The state cannot weaponize the law without enough public backing. For this, they launch a campaign of misinformation and disinformation, and they do this through multiple portals. They use social media, but far worse, they use communities. When we talk about disinformation in capitals, we don't understand the impact of misinformation and disinformation in communities. Women, particularly, when they can't walk out on the road, when they can't face their neighbor, when they can't face their landlord. This is very effective. This is far more effective than a viral Facebook post or an article in a state-led newspaper in really breaking down trust. It is stronger than a hashtag. In India we had urban Naxals. Far more effective was when your neighbor doesn't want to talk to you and they don't trust you anymore. You can't continue your work because it goes back to what drives you. Your passion is because you want to help your community. Suddenly, you are persona non grata. And this is what states do deliberately, and we don't counter it enough. We don't counter the digital security threats. Digital security in Sri Lanka and India and Pakistan that we've noticed is not always, Pegasus is what gets highlighted, but it's far more complicated than that. It is phishing, it is seizure, it is stealing of devices, and it is just the police stopping you at a checkpoint and saying hand over or else. So we don't need, that level of hacking. And I'm not saying hacking is not an important thing, because with the cases in India, we see that evidence was planted, that has been proven. They're still stuck in jail despite that. We've talked a lot about the defenders who are most at risk, and I think women came up significantly. A lot has been said about Afghanistan, but I think the gender apartheid currently happening in Afghanistan, and we use the term apartheid not legally, but to just reflect on the scale, is particularly felt by women defenders. Firozan, whose case that you mentioned, there are so many others who are fleeing, and the risk is worth taking, that the threat is big enough to take this huge risk to their lives. Internal protection is non-existent. If you are arrested, what is your recourse? There is no accountability. There are thoughts and prayers, and there is no censure for the Taliban, for the de facto authorities. There is nowhere for defenders to go to access protection. In that situation, what is the only solution? Resettlement, which is what she was trying to access when she was killed, I believe. We've documented cases of women defenders who have been tortured, who have suffered sexual violence, but even worse, we've talked to people, or as bad, the threat of violence, the fear that they are, the mental torture that they are put under because of their protests. And yet they persist. And they work. So it's not a reductionist zero-sum kind of absolutes that we are told to digest. There is resilience, there is persistence, and there is work. But Afghan women, I think particularly, as women in South Asia as well, need more solidarity, need more recognition. And being Afghan should not come with the occupational hazard that your blood is cheap, that, this is part of being Afghan. It is not. This was created and they're left there. So I think we need to do more for Afghan defenders. In terms of just concluding remarks, I want to highlight the cost to defenders in doing what they do, to recognize the commitment and to recognize in spaces like this what the states refuse to do, recognize their contribution, their daily contribution to community, to making the lives better, of communities' lives better. Why do they do this? Not because they wake up in the morning and think, I want to write a project proposal. They do it because they are committed to that community that they serve. And the cost to them is very high. And the cost is even higher when you have silence from the international community. International communities that respond and say, oh, but India reacts very, very violently and really seriously pushes back on any advocacy. Like, yes, but if that's how it feels like for you, imagine for the defenders inside the country. We have to engage with the Taliban, no doubt. But you can do this without isolating the defenders who are in the country. The cost to defenders is very high, and the cost to states is minimal. Natasha Edrisuriya is sitting in jail today at zero cost to the state. The state is weaponizing proxy wars against defenders. This is not only in Sri Lanka. They empower, they weaponize. We see this in Uttarakhand in India. We see this in Manipur right now. We've seen it in countless situations, and then the state distances itself from the impact. We see this in Sri Lanka, where religious extremists or extremists of different colors can walk across to a protest, a peaceful protest, and disrupt it and get away with it. A memorial protest or a memorial moment. We live in fear of them in some ways because we know they can do it and they can get away with it. Online threats of arrest against Natasha would translate into an actual arrest and persecution. This is not a joke. This is real comedy, actually. Not to take away from her humor, but this is comedy. That it's possible, it's real. And this woman remains in jail today. And the state has no cost. It's the easiest. The cost to the state is in not responding to religious extremists. So the state is also sometimes balancing a cost. And there's no pressure on them to increase the cost to the state. While defenders in countries like in the South Asian countries that I cover are doing their best. They're raising this cost as well as they can. There is more that needs to be done from international organizations, but also states who sit across the table from them at meetings. And these issues can't be raised. I think my final point is these are not issues that you raise only at human rights dialogues. You raise this everywhere. You raise it at trade. You raise it at dinner. You raise it on the International Day to celebrate their independence. You raise it at breakfast meetings. You just ask, what happened to Natasha? Why is Khurram in jail? Is he getting the attention he needs? Why is G.N. Sai Baba in jail? You can ask these questions. And as South Asia, I think we need to build more solidarity, asking it also of other countries. But thank you very much for the time, and I hope we can have a discussion.
Thanks to you, Diane. It was very informative overview and also like passionate intervention, and yes, it was great. And then I think the key patterns that you emphasize like resonates also more at the regional level. So after hearing from like after having heard regional context, we can now move on to the specific like situation in Sri Lanka. We'll do this with the third speaker of today, Nuwan Bopej. Nuwan is a human rights lawyer and then also is a member of the Young Lawyer Association. And like Nuwan has been providing pro bono legal assistance to a series of fellow defenders who are facing different forms of harassment because of their work, including judicial harassment, arbitrary arrest and detention. And yeah, Nuwan will provide us some insights of like what is the situation for human rights defenders in Sri Lanka, particularly in light of like last year, like mass protests and then like the new government. So Nuwan, over to you.
සියලු දෙනාටම සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක්. විශේෂයෙන්ම පශ්චාත් අරගල සමයක ඉන්න මොහොතක මිනිසුන්ගේ මානව හිමිකම් පිළිබඳව කතා බහ වැඩිපුර අපිට අහන්න ලැබෙන වෙලාවක් මේක. ඩියන් කිව්වා වගේ නටාෂා අද දින නැවත වතාවක් බන්ධනාගාරගත කෙරුණා. ඒ වගේම අපි ඊයේ ශිෂ්‍ය වීර දිනයක් මේ රටේ ක්‍රියා සමරනවා දැක්ක ශිෂ්‍යයෝ. මේ ක්‍රියාවලිය අපි ඉස්සරහට තවදුරටත් අධ්‍යයනය කරද්දී මං හිතන්නේ තවත් සති කිහිපයකින් ජූලි 9 උදා වෙනවා. මේ රටේ ඉතිහාසයේ ජනතාව තමුන්ගේ අයිතීන් වෙනුවෙන් පාරට බැහැලා විදායකය තමුන්ගේ ජනතා බලයෙන් නිරපන්න පුළුවන් වුණු දවසක්. ඉතින් මේ කතා බහ දවසින් දවස අලුත් වෙමින් තියෙන වෙලාවක මේ පශ්චාත් අරගල සමයේ අපි මූණ දෙමින් තිබෙන අභියෝගය පිළිබඳව අපිට හරි කියවා ගැනීමක් අවශ්‍ය වෙලා තියෙනවා. අපි දන්නවා මේ රටේ ජනතාව මීට වසරකට එහා පැත්තේ කාලයක අරගලයක් දියත් කරේ. විශේෂයෙන්ම එක් පැත්තකින් මේ රට වෙලාගෙන තිබෙන දේශපාලන සංස්කෘතිය ඒ පාදර දේශපාලන සංස්කෘතිය වෙනස් කරන්න ඊළඟට ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයේ තියෙන නවත් නිල් බලලු පුරුල් කරලා මිනිසුන්ගේ නව ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී අයිතීන් වාසිකම් දිනා ගන්න. ඒතර අපි අරගලයේ වැඩපිළිවෙල අධ්‍යයනය කරොත් අපි දන්නවා ඒකේ මූලික වශයෙන්ම යෝජනා කරපු කාරණයක් තමයි ජීවත් වීමේ අයිතිය ඇතුළු අපිට අහිමි කරලා තියෙන ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී අයිතීන් මූලික මිනිස් අයිතිවාසිකම් දිනාගන්නේ කොහොමද කියන කාරණය. ඉතින් එතනදී විශේෂයෙන්ම අපිට සංවාදයක් අවශ්‍ය වෙලා තියෙනවා. ෆෝරම් ඒෂියා ඇතුළු මේ සංවිධාන සියල්ල සිවිල් හා දේශපාලන අයිතිවාසිකම් සම්බන්ධයෙන් කාරණේදී අඛණ්ඩව අපි දකිනවා විවිධ විවේචන සහිත වුවත් තමුන්ගේ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයේ එක තලයකින් පවත්වාගෙන යනවා. අනිත් පැත්තෙන් වාම දේශපාලන ක්‍රියාකාරිකයෙකු විදියට මෙහි අනිත් අන්තයේ ඉඳමින් විශේෂයෙන්ම ලාංකීය සමාජය තුළ අපි දන්නවා අතීතයේ ඉඳන්ම වාමාංශික ප්‍රගතිශීලී ව්‍යාපාර වෙනත් කෝණයකින් මේ අරගලේ පවත්වාගෙන යනවා. එතනදී දැන් අපිට මතුවෙන ප්‍රශ්නය තමයි මේ සිවිල් හා දේශපාලන අයිතිවාසිකම් පිළිබඳව අපි අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම සටන් කර යුතුයි. ඒ පිළිබඳව අපි හැමදාම අරගල කර යුතුයි. නමුත් දැන් මේ මොහොත වන විට දෙවන පරම්පරාවේ අයිතිවාසිකම් පිළිබඳව වූ අරගලය අපේ සමාජයේ දියත් වෙලා තියෙනවද කියන කාරණය. ඒ කියන්නේ අපි දන්නවා ආර්ථික සහ සමාජීය අයිතිවාසිකම් පිළිබඳ අරගලය. මම ශිෂ්‍ය වීර දිනේ මතක් කරේ ශිෂ්‍යෝ තමුන්ගේ ජීවිතයේ කාලයක් තිස්සේ දිවි පිදුවේ අධ්‍යාපන අයිතිය, නිදහස් අධ්‍යාපනයේ අයිතිය මූලික අයිතිවාසිකමක් කරගන්න. ඒක හැමතිස්සෙම බද්ධ වෙලා තියෙන්නේ දෙවනි පරම්පරාවේ අයිතිවාසිකම් වලට. ආර්ථික හා සමාජීය අයිතිවාසිකම් වලට. ඒ දෙවනි පරම්පරාවේ අයිතිවාසිකම් අහිමි වීම නිසා ඒ වෙනුවෙන් අරගල කරන ජනතාවට, ශිෂ්‍යයට පළමු පරම්පරාවේ අයිතිවාසිකම් රැකදීම වෙනුවෙන් අපි සංවිධාන සටන් කරමින් ඉන්නවා. ඒ කියන්නේ නිදහස් අධ්‍යාපනයේ අයිතිය කියන ආර්ථික හා සමාජීය අයිතිවාසිකම දිනා ගන්න සටන් කරද්දී ඒක ඇතුලේ උල්ලංඝනය වෙනවා. භාෂණයේ ප්‍රකාශනයේ අයිතිය, රැස්වීමේ අයිතිය, සාමකාමී අයිතිය, සමාගමේ අයිතිය ඇතුළු පළමු පරම්පරාවේ අයිතිවාසිකම්. ඒක නිසා මම හිතන්නේ මේ නිශ්චිත මොහොත අපිට බල කළා සිටිනවා. අපිට සිවිල් සහ දේශපාලන අයිතිවාසිකම් වලට එහා ගිහිල්ලා ආර්ථික හා සමාජීය අයිතිවාසිකම් දිනා ගන්න වූ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයක් සමාජය තුළ ක්‍රියාත්මක කරනවා. ඉතින් අද මේ මානව හිමිකම් ක්‍රියාකාරීකයින් සම්බන්ධයෙන් සිදුවන පීඩාවන් පිළිබඳව කතා කරන, ඒ පිළිබඳව වාර්තා කරන මොහොතක අපි දන්නවා ලංකාවේ මේ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයට අදාළව නව ප්‍රවණතාවයක් තමයි පහුගිය අරගලයේ විසිදියත් කරේ. මම කලින් කිව්වා වගේ අපිට අත්දැකීම් තියෙනවා වාමාංශික ප්‍රගතිශීලී ව්‍යාපාර, ඒ වගේම රාජ්‍ය නොවන සංවිධානවල ක්‍රියාකාරකීන් කාලාන්තරයක් තිස්සේ මේවා සම්බන්ධයෙන් සටන් කරා. හැබැයි අරගලයේ ස්වභාවය වෙනස් එකක්. මේ කිසිදු ව්‍යූහයකට සම්බන්ධ නොවුණු තරුණයෝ ගණනාවක් ස්වේච්ඡා ශ්‍රමයෙන් අරගලයට සම්බන්ධ වුණා කියලා අපි දන්නවා. ගෝල්ෆේස් භූමියට සම්බන්ධ වෙච්ච සහෝදර සහෝදරීන් මෙතන ඉන්නවා. ඒතර මේ අලුත් ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වය මං හිතන්නේ අපේ රටට අලුත් අත්දැකීමක් වඩපත් වුණා. ඒ බොහෝ දෙනෙක් අද මේ දක්වාත් ස්වේච්ඡාවෙන් බිමේ අරගල කරමින් තිබෙනවා ක්‍රම වෙනසක් නැත්තම් වඩා හොඳ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී ක්‍රමයක් නිර්මාණය කර ගැනීම සඳහා. එතනදී දැන් අපි මුණ දෙමින් තියෙන අර්බුදය තමයි මේ වන විටත් ඒ අරගලයේ ක්‍රියාකාරීව හිටපු ක්‍රියාකාරකීන් බහුතරයක් කුමන හෝ නඩුවක මේ වන විට සැකකාරයෙක් බවට පත් වෙලා තිබෙනවා. පෙරේදා අපි පෙනී හිටියා නිට්ටඹුවේ සිද්ධියට අදාළ ඒ නඩුවට ඒ තැනැත්තන් 37 දෙනෙක් දැන් අවුරුද්දකට ආසන්න කාලයක් බන්ධනාගාරගත වෙලා තිබෙනවා. සාමාන්‍ය තත්වයේ තුල උපකල්පනය කරත් මිනිමැරුමක් සිද්ධ වුණා කියලා සියලු සාක්ෂි තිබුණා වුණත් ඊටමත් කෙටි කාලයකින් අප ලබා දීමේ රීතියට අනුව අප ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් තත්වයක් තියෙද්දී මේ අය කොහොමද අවුරුද්දකට කාලයකට වඩා අප ලබා නොගනිමින් ඉන්නේ කියන ගැටලුව අපි ඉස්සරහට මතුවෙමින් තියෙනවා. ඊළඟට අපි දන්නවා පහුගිය කාලයේ පුරාවටම විශේෂයෙන්ම අරගලයේ ක්‍රියාකාරකයන් අත්අඩංගුවට ගැනීමෙන් පසුව ඔවුන් සම්බන්ධයෙන් රජයේ රස පරීක්ෂකවරයා වෙත අරන් ගිහිල්ලා ත්‍රිමාන ඡායාරූප ගන්න තත්ත්වයට මේක පුළුල් වෙලා තියෙනවා. කුමන හේතුවක් නිසාද මේ අරගලයේ ක්‍රියාකාරකීන්ගේ ත්‍රිමාන ඡායාරූප ගන්න? අපි දන්නවා නමගිය අපරාධකරුවන්ගේ අපි ඔය විවිධ චිත්‍රපටිවල දකිනවා නමගිය අපරාධකරුවන්ගේ ත්‍රිමාන ඡායාරූප ගැනීම හරහා අඩුම තරමින් වෙස්වලාගෙනවත් රට තුල ඉන්න බැරි තත්වෙට ඔවුන්ගේ තොරතුරු ගබඩා කරගන්නවා. ඒ ප්‍රමාණයටම මේ රාජ්‍ය විසින් පහුගිය කාලේ අරගලයේ ක්‍රියාකාරකීන්ගේ ත්‍රිමාන ඡායාරූප දත් එකතු කිරීම පවා සිදු කරමින් තිබෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ ක්‍රියාවලිය කොතනටද දිගහැරෙමින් තිබෙන්නේ? ඒ දිගහැරෙමින් තිබෙන්නේ කොතනද කියන එකට අදාළව අපිට දැන් ජීවමාන සාක්ෂි ලැබෙමින් තිබෙනවා. මොනවද මේ ජීවමාන සාක්ෂි? මේ වන විට රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව ගෙන ඒමට උත්සාහ කරන පනත් ප්‍රමාණය ගැන ඔබ හැමෝටම අවබෝධය තිබෙනවා. අපි දන්නවා පුනරුත්ථාපන පන්තේ ඉඳන් ත්‍රස්ත විරෝධී පනතේ ඉඳන් මේ වන විට විකාශන නියාමන අධිකාරී පනත දක්වා පනත් ගණනාවක් ගෙනෙමින් මේ පෙළ හදමින් තිබෙන්නේ අර සිවිල් හා දේශපාලන අයිතිවාසිකම් කියලා දිනාගත් අයිතිවාසිකම් ප්‍රමාණය පවා තව දුරටත් සීමා කිරීම සඳහා. දැන් විකාශන නියාමන පනත සම්බන්ධයෙන් සංවාදයේ සමාජයේ ගොඩනැගෙමින් තිබෙනවා. ඒ හරහා මූලික මිනිස් අයිතිවාසිකම් මානව හිමිකම් කඩවීම නෙවෙයි. ඒ කඩවීම වාර්තා කිරීම නිසා මාධ්‍ය වාරණයට ලක්වීමේ අවදානමක් පැන නැගිමින් තිබෙනවා. ඒතර මේ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වය අපි තේරුම් ගන්න ඕනේ. නැවත වතාවක් මේ රටේ ජනතාව වෙනස් කරන්න උත්සාහ කරපු ඒ දේශපාලන සංස්කෘතිය, ඒ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයේ සීමා කිරීම නැවත වතාවක් වෙනත් වටයකින් තහවුරු කරන්න මේ රජය උත්සාහ දරමින් තිබෙනවා. මේ අභාවාජක අත්දැකීම තමයි අපි දන්නවා ලෝකයේ මේ වගේ ජනතා නැගී සිටීම වලින් සිදුවෙන්න ඕනේ සමාජයේ ඉන්න තත්වයෙන් තවත් අඩියක් හෝ ඉදිරියට යාම. සමාජයේ තියෙන පසුගාමිකම් යම් ප්‍රමාණයක් හෝ අඩු කරගන්න පුළුවන් වීම. නමුත් අපිට මූණ දෙන්න වෙලා තියෙන අභියෝගය තමයි ඒබඳු අරගලයකින් පසුව වුණත් සමාජයේ පසුගාමිකම් නැවතත් අපිට නැති කිරීම වෙනුවට වෙනත් මටයකින් තහවුරු වීමේ අවදානමක් අපි ඉස්සරහට ඇවිල්ලා තියෙනවා. ඒ විතරක් නෙවෙයි සමාජයේ කලින් තිබුණු මූලික මිනිස් අයිතිවාසිකම් ඒ ප්‍රමාණයෙන්වත් ආරක්ෂා කරගන්න බැරි තත්ත්වයක් පත් වෙලා තිබෙනවා. උදාහරණයක් විදිහට මැද පෙරදිග ජනතා නැගිටීම් වලින් පසුව තහවුරු වුණු ආණ්ඩු නැවත වතාවක් අන්තවාදය වෙනත් විදියකින් තහවුරු කරන ආණ්ඩු බවට පත්වීමේ අත්දැකීම අපිට තියෙනවා. දැන් අපේ රටෙත් ගොඩ නැගෙමින් තිබෙන්නේ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයේ පිළිබඳව පුළුල් අරගලයක් සිද්ධ කිරීමෙන් අනතුරුව පවා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයේ තිබුණු අයිතිවාසිකම් පවා භුක්ති විඳින්න බැරි තත්වයට සමාජයේ පසුගාමී වෙලා තිබෙනවා. ඒ විතරක් නෙවෙයි පහුගිය කාලය තුල අරගලයේ විසින් දියාරු කරන්න උත්සාහ කරපු ජාතිවාදී ආගම්වාදී ප්‍රවණතා නැවත වෙන වටයකින් හිස ඔසවමින් තිබෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ අභියෝගයේදී අපිට එක්සත්ව ගන්න ඕන ක්‍රියාමාර්ග තිබෙනවා. ඒ එක්සත්ව ගන්න ඕන ක්‍රියාමාර්ග තමයි මේ හැම තලයකම අරගල කරන මානව හිමිකම් ක්‍රියාකාරකීන්, ඒ විතරක් නෙවෙයි වාමාංශික නැත්නම් ප්‍රගතිශීලී ක්‍රියාකාරකීන් මේ හැමෝටම මේ එල්ලවන ප්‍රහාරයට ප්‍රතිප්‍රහාරය සාම්ප්‍රදායික අවි වලින් දීලා ප්‍රමාණවත් වන්නේ නැහැ. මම සාම්ප්‍රදායික අවි කියලා අදහස් කරේ වෙන දෙයක් නෙවෙයි. මේ මතවාදී අවි, අපි ගාව තියෙන මතවාදී අවි වඩා ගැඹුරු, වඩා තීව්‍ර ආකාරයෙන් පාවිච්චි කිරීම සඳහා අපිට බල කරමින් තිබෙනවා. එසේ නොවුනොත් වෙන්නේ මේ සංස්කෘතිය මීටත් වඩා දරුණු ලෙස යලිත් වරක් ස්ථාපනය වීම හරහා මේ සමාජය ඉදිරියට නෙවෙයි තවදුරටත් පසුපසට ගමන් කිරීමේ ස්වරූපයක් අපි අත්දකිමින් තිබෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ මොහොත වෙන විට අපි දන්නවා අපේ ලාංකීය සමාජයේ ගත්තට පස්සේ මානව හිමිකම් ක්‍රියාකාරකයන් විතරක් නෙවෙයි තනියම බෝඩ් එකක් තමුන්ගේ ඇඟේ එල්ලගෙන තනියම පාගමනක් යන නූඩ්ලගේ පන්නේ ජනතාවට පවා ඒ ගමන යන්න බැරි තත්වයට සීමා වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ තත්වය මම හිතනවා මානව හිමිකම් ක්‍රියාකාරකයන් සහ වෙනත් ප්‍රගතිශීලී ක්‍රියාකාරකීන්ට අත්විඳින්න වෙන ස්වභාවය තවදුරටත් තීව්‍ර වීමේ අවදානමක් ඉදිරියට තිබෙනවා. මේ තත්වය මේ විදිහට ගියොත් අද මේ බීතිය අත්අඩංගුවට ගැනීම වලින් එහාට ගිහිල්ලා නැවත වතාවක් මෙම ක්‍රියාකාරකීන් දඩයම් කිරීම, ඝාතනය කිරීම දක්වා මේ ප්‍රවණතාවයේ යෑමේ අවදානමක් තිබෙනවා. මොකද අපි ඉස්සරහා දිගහැරමින් තිබෙන ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ හමුවේදී එබඳු ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයන් කරා යෑමේ දැඩි අවදානමක් තිබෙනවා. ඒක නිසා අපිට මේ මොහොතට මුහුණ දෙන්න වෙන්නේ එක්සත් ක්‍රියාමාර්ග හරහා එක්සත්ව සංවිධානගතව කියන කාරණය අපි මේ වෙලාවේදී බරපතල ලෙස අවධානය කරගත යුතු වෙනවා. ඒක නිසා විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ ව්‍යායාමයේ අගය කරන ගමන් අපි ඉල්ලා සිටින්න සිද්ධ වෙනවා විශේෂයෙන්ම රාජ්‍ය නොවන සංවිධාන ක්‍රියාකාරකීන් ඒ වගේ වෙනත් ක්‍රියාකාරකීන්ට මේ දිගහැරමින් තිබෙන තත්වයට ඔබ කොහොමද අවතීර්ණ විය යුත්තේ කියන කාරණේ පිළිබඳව සංවාදයක් අවශ්‍යයි කියන කාරණේ. එතනදී මා යෝජනා කර සිටිනවා පළමු කාරණේ විදියට සිවිල් හා දේශපාලන අයිතිවාසිකම් වෙනුවෙන් ඔබ යම් අරගලයක් කරනවා නම් ඒ අරගලය වඩා තීව්‍ර කළා ඒ අරගලය තවදුරටත් ඉදිරියට ගෙන යාමට අවශ්‍ය වෙනවා අපි ආර්ථික හා සමාජීය අයිතිවාසිකම් මිනිසුන්ට දිනා දීම. ඒක සඳහා දේශපාලන පරිවර්තනයක් අවශ්‍ය වෙනවා. ඒ දේශපාලන පරිවර්තනයේදී සාම්ප්‍රදායිකව සිවිල් හා දේශපාලන අයිතිවාසිකම් පිළිබඳව පමණක් පෙනී නොසිට ජනතාවගේ ආර්ථික සහ සමාජීය අයිතිවාසිකම් වෙනුවෙනුත් පෙනී සිටීමේ අභියෝගයක් අපිට තිබෙනවා. ඊළඟට එතනින් එහාට ගිහිල්ලා මම යෝජනා කරන්නේ මේ වන විට ගෙන ඒමට උත්සාහ දරන නෛතික ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ සම්බන්ධයෙන් තීරණාත්මකව මැදිහත් වෙලා ඒවා පරාජය කරන්න අවශ්‍ය ශක්තිය සහ ඒ මඟ පෙන්වීම අපේ සමාජයට දෙන්න ඔබගෙන් අපිට උදව් අවශ්‍ය වෙනවා කියන කාරණය අපි මේ මොහොතේ අවධානය කරන්න වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම අවසාන වශයෙන් අවධානය කරන්න සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ මේ අරගලයේ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වය තුල ගොඩ නැගුණු නව ඒ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයන් ඒ නව ස්වේච්ඡාශ්‍රමය වගුරන ඒ නව પરම්පරාව සම්බන්ධයෙන් ඒ අයව ආරක්ෂා කරගෙන ඒ අයගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් වෙනුවෙන් පෙනී සිටින අතර ඒ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වය තවදුරටත් පුළුල් කිරීමට අවශ්‍ය ක්‍රියාමාර්ග විශේෂයෙන්ම සමාජයේ තරුණ කොටස් විශාල වශයෙන් අරගලයට එකතු වුණා. ඒ අයව කොහොමද තමුන්ගේ ස්වේච්ඡා ශ්‍රමයක් කරා මේ සමාජය වෙනස් කරන තැනට ගෙනියන්න කියන එකට අදාළව මඟ පෙන්වීමක් අවශ්‍යයි කියලා මම විශ්වාස කරනවා. ඒ ක්‍රම තුන මේ මොහොතේ අපේ සමාජයේ ඉල්ලා සිටිනවා කියන අදහස තමයි මට තියෙන්නේ. ඉතින් මේ සම්බන්ධයෙන් මම තවදුරටත් අවධානය කරනවා නම් මම ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන් ඒ කරුණේ යම් කෙටි අවබෝධයක් ලැබලා දෙන්නම්. In fact, actually this post Aragale era, we have a big challenge. That is because we know the uncouth political culture which was existing prior to the Aragale. Now once again this Ranil Wickremesinghe regime is going to establish in a different way. Mainly they are focused on implementing new legal reforms with very draconian nature, likewise Rehabilitation Act, Anti-Terrorism Act, and recently this Broadcast Regulatory Act. So in terms of these acts, it's very clear the Ranil Wickremesinghe regime is expecting to somehow put pressure on activists, human rights activists, and other progressive masses in order to sustain this political power which actually masses wanted to wipe out 1 year ago. So in this juncture, actually it is very important us to have a discussion rather than only concentrate on civil and political rights of the people. Actually these all incidents are part and parcel with the economic and social rights of the people. Once you are going to fight for economic and social rights, of course, then you have to gather, you have to express their ideas openly, which are related to civil and political rights. Therefore, I humbly request this forum and at the same time non-government organizations. At this juncture, it is very important. You are fighting for civil and political rights. Simultaneously, there must be a fight in this society for a political change which directly connected to social and political rights of the people. Once you implement, once you were able to establish these economic and social rights of the people, of course, that will be the concrete solution of these kind of burning issues in the society. Therefore, at the same time, I would say that most of the activists of the Aragale now almost suspects of around 50 cases pending in Sri Lanka. So they are there are mentally harassment for that, especially because of these pending cases, always they are in a difficulty to continue their activism. Actually, new dimension has been opened during the Aragale. A lot of youth, through their voluntary labor, wanted to change this society and change the system. So in order to encourage them, if we are expecting a system change, at the same time, if we are expecting a country with new democratic rights, of course, these assets we have to use. However, now we are in a difficulty to continue these assets because of these draconian nature of laws. At the same time, this is state repression. Therefore, your involvement to resist this conduct of the government, at the same time your involvement to insist government to recall these new draconian law reforms is highly important in this juncture. At the same time, all in all I want to say, we should have a collective measures to somehow conquer these economic and social rights of the people. Otherwise, day-to-day life, once again we have to face these kind of incidents. There won't be end of violations of fundamental rights of the people. Therefore, I would like to thank Forum Asia and Law Society Trust for organizing this and inviting me. Therefore, actually this particular report will be very useful us when we are doing our activities here on the ground. So I would like to thank for that as well, and at the same time, I invite you to get together and and work together to protect the rights of the human rights defenders and progressive masses of the country. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nuwan. It was very interesting, like to hear some also first-hand experience from you, and then also to learn more about some specific cases like in Sri Lanka that are on the rise. So like Nuwan intervention closed our panel discussion. So now we will go for Q&A session. So like whoever from the public has questions, feel free to like to ask. Before that, would be great if you could introduce yourself and also let us know what language the question will come, so like those who in interpretation can also hear your question. So yeah, thank you.
The report itself is very comprehensive. The report itself is very comprehensive. How did you distill the number of the violations? Is that what is reported in the popular press, you know, or did you sort of group them together? Because I'm quite sure there are more than 1,400 violations across the region. So is this a sample? I mean, your methodology section may have really talked about that. And if you are doing this as an annual report, will you know, expand the methodology to be more comprehensive? I think that would be quite useful for us to know. And also it would be great if these reports can be translated, or it is a recommendation and final findings translated into regional languages so that monitoring can go through.
Thank you so much for that question, Sakuntala. And on the methodology, yes, we the way we collect our cases and document them is from the credible sources, media sources from across Asia, but also from other terms of advocacy materials, such as the UN communications that we have access to, and also our direct communications with our member organizations and other partner organizations that we talk with, and in some cases also from direct communications, confidential communications from human rights defenders themselves, which are recorded in the number of cases that we document on the portal, but sometimes they are recorded confidentially. So the details of the event is not revealed to the public, but we still have it in the back end. And we, in terms of expanding the methodology, we are open to suggestions. The number of cases, 1,636 cases, of course, is an underrepresentation, considering that not all of the cases of violations against the defenders are reported or are even brought up to the surface. Sometimes they are the violations that happen in isolation, and these are not known to the public. So of course these cases are underrepresented, and we are always open to expanding our methodology to improve our ways of documenting these cases. For translation, yes, we are of course open to that as well. Maybe Valerio can actually discuss more about the some country documentation that we also do. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you, Sakuntala, for the valid point. I'm the moderator, but I will also address this a bit because I am one of those that who work on the portal, so I'm happy to add something on top of like what Adrian shared. So the methodology also highlights some of the limitations that we have in conducting our monitoring and documentation work. And indeed, like as you rightly pointed, like the cases that happen like on the ground are much more than what we are able to capture, and like it's inevitable like that. Not all cases can be like documented, and I think in this case also the presentation was quite illustrative of the key trends. And one of the ways that we are trying to use to tackle like this limitation is by having some partnership with some of our members in specific countries who work on the documentation of cases at the national level. So we have piloted this in the past couple of years in Indonesia, Nepal, and like this year we are starting with LST, a similar partnership, like to document and to improve also our documentation of the cases in Sri Lanka. This, of course, is only one tool that we are using, because otherwise we will face limitation, like language-wise, because we will be able only to capture like what is reported in like English news, which is not always like easy to capture. And then also, as Diane mentioned, like there might be English translation that bring a different narrative to human rights defenders, not necessarily picturing them as HRDs, but for example, they can be by some like media aligned to the government. They might be portrayed as like enemy of the state or like as anti-development defenders. So also we need to have some good perspective of like how HRDs are portrayed to make sure that this case can be encoded in our portal. I hope this addressed like your questions. And
no, I was just thinking that maybe if you can develop a portal so that it doesn't become onerous, you can just plug in, maybe the organizations who are supporting you can just plug in the violations as they are reported, 20 the land rights activists arrested or harassed or whatever. So then you have an ongoing list, so that's a more powerful database. I think that would help. Okay.
Sure, I think makes sense. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. I think again is valid, and yes, I mean like the portal is it's for public use, so it's like it's open and like can be accessed, and most of the large majority of the entries are in English, and eventually it's always like Forum Asia who encodes like the cases. This is also to ensure consistency with like the way we are encoding the cases. But then, I agree with you that it would be good one day to try to expand, make it like more accessible also for non-English speakers. So thank you again for this. And if there are no other questions, like I do have some, like for like particularly for Diane, and one based on like their presentation, like building up from like what they shared earlier. So for Diane, after this presentation about the trends of violations against human rights defenders in South Asia, I'd like to ask you, what do you foresee will be in the upcoming future the challenges for human rights defenders, like in the sub-region, and also if you think that there will be some hopes for them, and how this can be addressed?
Okay, this works. Yeah. So I think very briefly, the challenges will be how to continue, like Nuwan said, how to continue working and persisting when there's so much being used against you, and particularly the weaponizing of the law, and the law on free speech, the law on your work, and I think something that doesn't get touched on, it's also the law on freedom of association. So access to resources, the ability to function, it's going to be very difficult, and many of the challenges, I think, will be legal. We did live in an era where there was a lot of enforced disappearances, killings, and we see that in some parts of South Asia. But one of the biggest challenges is going to be using legal tools to abuse. Another challenge is, I think, the proxy wars, using right-wing extremist groups, or you can call them what you want, but the label is also given by the state, and then they are weaponized against defenders. This is going to be very difficult to counter, and it's something that we will have to be, it's growing. And it's growing also in response to popular movements, like the protest movement. When the state can't counter that, then they build their own narrative and they create their own proxy armies, and we see this in different contexts. So it's very difficult to counter, but it's a definite challenge. And I think in terms of for South Asia, because we're speaking regionally, the lack of still an effective regional solidarity method. We saw this a little bit during the protests, where the student movements were speaking and were more in line to communicate. We see this with Kuram and for some of the bigger cases. But on forest rights, land rights, indigenous defenders fighting battles in an unheard part of say India, Baloch defenders, environmental rights defenders who are not known or heard of. There's very little cross-regional solidarity. So I think we really need to
move from the high-level names, the high-profile names, whom everybody knows, and and move towards those that are lesser known and access them, led by them, where relevant, to build those linkages. So nothing artificial, but at least starting the conversation. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Diane. And yeah, I also have a quick question for Nuwan. This is a follow-up from your presentation. Since you mentioned about the increasing challenges of human rights defenders in Sri Lanka and also the different forms of threats that they are facing, and Natasha's case is only the last one. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think, like, what type of support is needed for human rights defenders in Sri Lanka? Like, what will be the most effective way to support human rights defenders? This can come from international human rights organization, from like UN agencies, for like donors. So yeah, up to you. How do you think yeah, the most effective way will be to support HRDs in this context?
Yeah, now actually, now the state repression now directly connected to the economic crisis as well. You know, now the IMF is going to give us grant subject to certain conditions. Now it's very clear in terms of IMF conditions, the privatization and curtail of other rights are inevitable. So in a situation like being international organization, I think it is very important you to put pressure, internationally put pressure on the Sri Lanka state, and at the same time, institutions such as IMF, when they are going to implement these conditions, it is very important to think about the other dimensions like fundamental rights of the people and freedom of the people. So on one hand, now state is bringing various draconian laws. At the same time, IMF having certain discussions regarding the good governance and transparency, etc. So what you can expect regarding good governance when a government is simultaneously bringing these kind of draconian laws? Therefore, I think in this juncture, as far as the Sri Lankan situation is concerned, it is very important to put pressure not only to the state, at the same time international institutions such as IMF. Secondly, actually, I would, even in my presentation, I emphasize that basically most of the struggles are directly connected to economic and social justice. So economic rights concern now, you know, according to recent research, actually Sri Lankan, the poverty has been drastically increased. So therefore people are fighting for their economic rights. So, but most, of course, being human rights activists, we are mainly concentrate on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc. So why people want to shout? Why people want to come to streets and make demonstrations? Most of the demands are directly connected to the economic rights. So therefore, now they are going to bring new labor reforms. So these, it is very clear these new labor reforms, what they are trying to do, actually now the security, as far as the safety of laborers are concerned, Sri Lankan laws are very strong. Now actually they really wanted to dilute these strong laws and regulation and introduce low-cost labor, at the same time slavery in Sri Lanka. So in a situation like that, of course, the labor movement has to fight against that. Therefore, in order to prevent those fights only, they are bringing anti-terrorism bills. Therefore, we can see this connection between the state policies and the new laws to be implemented. Therefore, it is very important on your part, put pressure on the government, not only in respect of these the political and social rights, at the same time insist them to somehow protect and actually develop the economic and social rights of the people. I think that is part of the directive principles in the Constitution. Going beyond that, whether we have to see whether we can right to education should be a fundamental right. Right to wage should be a fundamental right. When we think about a state sector, actually they don't have, they only have day wage. They don't have a salary. So we have to fight for right to wage. Likewise, we have to somehow put pressure on the state to, rather than just defending them, insist them to actually bring these kind of new sort of rights, fundamental rights, rights as fundamental rights in the constitution.
Thanks, Numan. It was, again, insightful and, yeah. So now, before wrapping up, sorry, go ahead.
Hi,
Sorry.
so I'm just going to ask a question. And I'm just wondering whether there's any regional strategies, any research on any regional strategies on maybe what actually does work that has not been documented. So in Sri Lanka, some of what I have kind of like picked up on is quiet diplomacy that could work, or conversations with the Attorney General's Department, conversations with embassies as to what to bring up, personal relationships that you might have with law enforcement officials. All of that is important. I'm just wondering, because this is the same playbook that is possibly being used across many of the countries in the region. I'm wondering whether we can share some experiences on what might actually have worked, or would actually even reflecting on that be a compromise on the rule of law and everything that we actually work for.
Thank you for the question. And is there anyone from the panel who wants to? Okay, Diane, thank you.
Start with, I think on the private advocacy or the quiet strategies that do work, the less said in a public forum, perhaps the better. Just starting with that. Because there are many strategies that defenders use locally, not just, INGOs are completely not the key players in this. It is local defenders who find ways to stay safe and survive. This is a country that has seen a war, it has seen multiple struggles, we've also seen in the region. So they are obviously surviving because they found organic and real ways of functioning. And the role of some of our organizations, I think, is to support that, is to build that link if needed, but very much to, it's not the first line of engagement. I will say, though, that it's a very good point on what works is usually sustained effort. What works is not flash in, flash out. Like today we want to work on Dalit defenders, so here we are. Or, Afghanistan and gender is a big topic, or it's a, so don't, I think that is something that really makes a difference for organizations coming from the outside. Strategies also depend on your location. So if you're located on the inside and you are directly impacted, your strategies would differ from what we document. What helps is to have that persistence and the linkage between different actors, so not everyone needs to go and do the visible advocacy. Some can do quiet advocacy. Some continue to engage with the state. Some continue to engage with corporate interests in order to make sure that that safety is assured. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. But I also think, and I just want to end with that, public advocacy should not be discounted. Softly, softly, gently, gently towards states is not working. They're getting away with it. What you say to them privately matters, but if there are no results and the public persecution continues, and this I speak for across South Asia, then softly, softly, gently, gently doesn't work. We need benchmarks, so that also works. When communities set benchmarks, defenders are anyway setting benchmarks. That is happening automatically. It is others who have a problem. Set benchmarks for engagement and stick to them. Call it out when those benchmarks are not met to the extent possible. Those are strategies that work, even if there's no immediate resolution. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane. And are there any other questions? Maybe we have time for one more, if there's any.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So this is to the entire panel. So, as you have been discussing about the cases from 2021 and 22, the incidents across Asia about human rights defenders. So, I think definitely the people who have counted all these cases must know that how these support, legal support and the support to the defenders, especially like people like Kuram, we know what's happening. So it's 500 days and how it is, the case has been dealt with the Indian administrative Jammu Kashmir. But like the people who are from the low level or from the places where we cannot reach out to them. So what's the situation? So this is out of the topic, maybe with the, not related to directly to the report, but is there any consideration or any concern with you all, or any platform or group doing any work to the entire people, like, or do they have any forum to deal with? Like, I'm not speaking about the HRD, but is there anything else that is supporting each and everyone? For example, in Sri Lanka, as Bope said, more than a year now, 37 are inside. So is there any other forums that's supporting them, or any other ways to support them, not just getting the numbers? There are so many cases, there are 1,600 cases, but it's good to have a research, but more than that, how it is being addressed, is there any way? Any concerns do you have?
So in terms of having a platform for the defenders to share their concerns, that's what you mean, right? Yes, I think us documenting these cases and providing an insight and analysis of regional overview is just one step, is like maybe the first step. And from that, the defenders, the civil society organizations can use this information to engage with the wider public, with the international community, and also within the local communities. So that might be one step of doing this. In terms of other platforms or other advocacy strategies, there can be, for example, communications directly with the UN special mechanisms, or engagement with embassies, or the engagement with National Human Rights Commission, depending on how their reputation is. But I think what Diane mentioned, and also Nuwan touched on this, what's important is the solidarity. And of course, just the international organizations talking to each other is not enough. It should be sort of an overall engagement of both the international organizations, the local organizations, and also the individual defenders. And I think that is an organic development, as Diane also mentioned before. So that's, yeah, that's just like one way of engagement. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks both for the question and answer. And I think we are running out of time, but before wrapping up, I'd like to ask the panelists if they have any closing remark, any conclusion they want to add. Maybe just 1 minute each before you wrap up. So yeah, if you have any, feel free to share. And Hadrian, if you have, we can start with you and then to the usual order.
All right, thank you so much. So as I have been discussing the outcomes of this publication, Defending in Numbers, as well as what Diane and Nuwan have discussed today with their insights, I think we can all see that the dire situation that the defenders, as well as their families and friends, are facing in their everyday lives. So what we need to ensure, I believe, are to ensure accountability mechanism of these violations, to remove this culture of impunity on the perpetrators, and to establish a system in which that the defenders can benefit from. And this includes repealing repressive laws and draconian laws, such as the incitement charges or defamation charges, in the framework of the incitement charges or defamation charges that the defenders are often targeted with. I think it is also very important to recognize the defenders' resilience and the work that they do despite these challenges, and also at the end of it to express our solidarity in that. And also would like to reemphasize my recommendations from earlier for states, both states, international community, and also the civil society. And to ensure that both the remedial and preventative measures are taken so that the violations and harassment against defenders are can be stopped entirely. Yeah, that's it, and thank you again for so much for being here in person or online, and thank you so much for listening.
So I think it's just outreach. Defender-led has no meaning if you don't make it accessible, the support that is available. I speak obviously from a location of being part of an INGO that works on South Asia, so thoughts would differ depending. But for this minute, I think for me it is about outreach. That is something we always struggle with, and follow-up, consistency. And making sure that defenders are available, know what support is available, and the limitations of that support. And that, you know, defender-led does not mean that INGOs then take up that space. It's also sitting back, letting local movements happen, and then being informed and advised and educated on where your value addition is. And I think that's, for me, really critical in understanding and reflecting on reports like this, and also the practical support that defenders should be given beyond the documentation and the advocacy, and I think you alluded to that. So that support is available. Most people may not know it's there. And making that accessible, because otherwise we're sticking to a small group that are linking. And that's also really something that we need to counter when we're dealing with movements and wide-scale repression. So those are just kind of reflections from the discussion. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing. Actually, within the liberal democracy, actually sometimes we believe if there is an independent judiciary, independent court system, of course that will be helpful to protect the rights of the people. Recent past, there's experience that after giving a particular judgment, actually these judges were summoned to the parliament before privilege committees. So that indicate that the inference is very clear. This state repression is now going to extend it up to judiciary as well. Therefore, I just want to emphasize the situation is getting worse. There are some unprecedented incidents like this. Therefore, at this juncture, I think human rights defenders, and not only human rights defenders, judicial officers, and other important segments of the society also at a risk. So we have to be mindful about that as well.
Thank you for your closing remark to the three of you. And this closes today's event. So I would like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone who participated, both those who attended in person, those who are joining online. And yeah, I wish you all a nice rest of the day. Thank you.